let's turn together to the Old Testament book of Ruth. Hey, I already said that. Just as we talked about the joy of completing the book of Acts together, we get the joy of starting a new book this morning. And this is a little bit briefer one than the book of Acts was, but it's fun to start a new book. One of Crystal and I's little quirks. Oh, by the way, 19th anniversary this week we get to celebrate, so we are creeping up toward that point where we've been married to each other for half of our lives. Not quite there, but almost. So that is such a blessing. One of our little quirks is that we enjoy driving roads we've never driven before. And I'm not referring to ways taking you on back streets to miss traffic. I'm referring to out-of-the-way places, especially here in Southern California, that we've never explored. Many times she and I have said to each other, we've never been in this road before. And so we seek out those opportunities. And we will probably do that again this week in part of our anniversary celebration. So that makes me think of starting into a new book of the Bible. Not that the book of Ruth is probably a completely new road for most of you. Many of you read it at some point, but to start into a study like this together is still a joy. It won't be a lengthy road. The plan, Lord willing, is 5 sermons through Ruth. I am going to refer to Ruth as a story many times this morning. We often call these 66 things in our Bible books, which works and is okay, but when you've got something as brief as Ruth, it's a little odd to keep calling it a book. So going to refer to it as a story, but by calling it a story, do not understand me to mean that it is made up, as if it is some sort of spiritual allegory or just an illustration of things. Ruth fits into a vital place in Israel's history, a place that could have been historically disproven if untrue. In other words, she was the great-grandfather of the most famous king in a nation that took its genealogies very seriously. And she was, did I say great-grandfather? Great-grandmother. Yes, that would be better. She was the great-grandmother and a Moabitess. So I think you can be pretty certain that if this story was made up, there would have been a serious birther controversy when David was trying to get elected as king of Israel. And I say that lightheartedly, but my point is that it's nearly impossible in a historical sense how Ruth could have been a made-up character. And then that's just verified for certain for us when we get to Matthew chapter 1, and there she is in the genealogy of Jesus. So a story, but an account of real things that happened with real people, not just some sort of spiritual illustration or something. So a story that really happened, an ancient story. How long ago? 3,200 years ago or something like that, 3,100 years ago. So very, very old. Now, if you're not familiar with this story, let me just go over a very brief outline of what happened. A famine struck the land of Israel, and a Jewish family decided that they had no choice but to leave the land and go to Moab. Moab was a nation near Israel geographically, just across the river, but far from Israel in religion and in politics. So this wife and husband and 2 sons moved to and lived in Moab in this foreign land, and before long, tragedy struck. Dad died at a fairly young age. So then there's mom and 2 boys. The 2 boys married Moabite women. Tragedy struck 2 more times. Both sons died. Now, early deaths were, of course, much more common then than they are today. But still, 3 tragic deaths in one family was heartbreaking, and it was dangerous for the women who were left behind, these 3 widows. So this Jewish woman, Naomi, was left in Moab with her Moabite daughter-in-laws, Orpah and Ruth. Eventually, she heard that agriculturally things had turned around again in Israel, so she went back. And one of her Moabite daughter-in-laws went back with her, and that's our title character here, Ruth. Once they came back to the town of Bethlehem, where their family was from, they had very little way to find food except to essentially beg And so to avoid starvation, Ruth put herself into a very risky situation, venturing out into the fields in the hope that there would be some farmer who would allow her to take the leftover grain from the harvesting process in his fields. This was a Moabite woman. She would hardly be welcome among the Israelites, and gleaning by herself like this was dangerous. Yet in God's kind providence, she ended up picking grain in the field of a man who chose to treat her with respect and kindness. And that man was Boaz. And in the end, after some drama and uncertainty, Boaz took upon himself the financial responsibility for Naomi and her family, and he married Ruth. And when Ruth and Boaz had a son, this legally continued the family line of Naomi's family, which ended up to be extremely important because that was the line of King David. To put it in one sentence, it is ultimately a story of God's grace shining unexpectedly in a very dark time. It is grace in darkness. Let's pause and pray before we go into some introduction. Father, we have to hear your word. It is no more optional for us than food was for Ruth and Naomi when they went back to Bethlehem. We must not spiritually starve. We need the words of the living God. And so we look to this story now, not for our own curiosity's sake, not for education and the accumulation of trivia and Bible knowledge, but for the God of this story, the realities that this story shows us about who you are and who we are, that we might know you, that we might love you, that we might worship you, that we might follow you with faithfulness. So help us to study this book well in a way that will honor you. And for all of the effort we may put into reading and understanding and teaching, all is vain without your Spirit using the living word, either to bring dead hearts to life or to renew and refresh hearts you have already made alive with this living water. So we ask you to feed, to nourish your people through your word. In Jesus' name, amen. There are lots of intriguing details in this book. I will kind of scatter those over the next 4 weeks as we study. But for today, the goal is just to try to get some big perspective on this little story. So let's read Ruth 1, verses 1 through 6. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. A quick note about Old Testament names, since we have a bunch of them here, and just how I handle those. I've mentioned this before, but you can go look up the names in Hebrew and try to get maybe a proper pronunciation of them and try to use that in preaching and teaching it. And to that I say phooey. For a couple of reasons. One, Hebrew pronunciation is notoriously very difficult to know how it would have actually been pronounced. So even if we go look up Hebrew pronunciation, it's very unlikely we're anywhere close to right. And second of all, it just adds this kind of layer of there's a secret insider knowledge with the Bible and you don't have it because you don't know that it's actually Ruth and Nangami and Ngorpa and whatever. And it just ends up creating a barrier between a person and the Bible. They don't want to read. They don't want to read out loud because they're going to get it wrong, you know. So in general, the way I handle Bible names is I try to just pronounce them how they make sense to me in English off the page, and that, you know, we may differ on that in how we look at some of those vowels and things. But my point is, it doesn't matter. Your spirituality is not based on knowing that poor Ruth was actually named Ruth. Okay, so 10 observations this morning, an introduction to this story. Number one, this is an intentional story. An intentional story. It's not just somebody's memoirs or a little love story that somehow randomly appears in the Old Testament. You see that verse 1 begins, in the days when the judges ruled. Boy, that was a very dark and important time in Israel's history. So there's an intentional setting here. And in our English Bibles, the book is positioned right after Judges. So you have one of the most startling books in the Bible, followed immediately by this little story. Let's go back and see just a little bit of that. So back to Judges chapter 2. It's easy to find Judges since it's right before Ruth. Judges chapter 2. So the book of Judges squeezes in between the lengthy period of all the kings in Israel. That comes after it. And the period of entering into the promised land through Joshua, that's what comes right before it. In between is this very dark time that we call the time of the Judges. Judges 2, verse 10. And all that generation also were gathered to their fathers. That was the generation that entered the promised land initially. And there arose another generation after them who did not know Yahweh or the work that he had done for Israel. And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. And they abandoned Yahweh, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went after other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them and bowed down to them. And they provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And he gave them over to plunderers who plundered them. And he sold them into the hand of their surrounding enemies so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them for harm, as the Lord had warned and as the Lord had sworn to them. And they were in terrible distress. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hand of those who plundered them. Yet they did not listen to their judges, for they whored after other gods and bowed down to them. They soon turned aside from the way in which their fathers had walked, who had obeyed the commandments of the Lord, and they did not do so. Whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he saved them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who afflicted and oppressed them. But whenever the judge died, they turned back and were more corrupt than their fathers, going after other gods, serving them and bowing down to them. They did not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways. You see why we call it a dark time? Now, Judges 21, the end of the book of Judges, last chapter, Judges 21 and verse 25. The most famous verse in Judges 21:25. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And then, in our English Bibles, Ruth 1:1 immediately follows. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. Okay, so the intentionality is evident from the very beginning. It's also evident from the ending. If you look in Ruth chapter 4, how does the book of Ruth end? With a little selective genealogy. It appears to begin in verse 18, but actually the connection is back to Judah in verse 12. Judges 4:12 mentions Judah, and Judah's son was Perez. So verse 18, these are the generations of Judah's son Perez. And you read a series of names there leading to the last word in the book, which is David, right? So this book is clearly intended to intentionally point us back to Judah and ahead to King David. Okay, so first thing, it's not a random little story. It has a very intentional place in the Old Testament and in the entire Bible. Number two, this is a story of a mighty man and woman. A mighty man and woman. We'll see the details about that later, but for now, my point is that Ruth has a reputation for being a story for the ladies. Perfect for a ladies' Bible study, or a ladies' tea, or something involving lace and ribbons. And we just have to set that perception aside. It is true that at some point in Israel's history, they decided to title this story Ruth, but it could have just as easily been titled Boaz. He is a mighty man who demonstrates his strength in many ways. And Boaz is not the only important man in the story. Much of what unfolds for this family came from Elimelech, Naomi's husband, and his leadership. You see his name in Ruth 1, verse 2. So there are some key men in this story, including one mighty man. And then there's Ruth, who is also portrayed as a very strong woman, working all day in the fields, risking her reputation and safety, at one point carrying about 80 pounds of grain on her back. So it is hardly a soft and frilly story, and it's definitely not just a story for the ladies. Number three, this is a story of a real family. As I mentioned earlier, it's not some type of allegory. It's not illustration or fable. It's an actual Jewish family. Ruth 1, verse 1 ends with the words, he and his wife and his 2 sons. So there was their little family. And we have in verse 2 their names, Elimelech, Naomi, Mahlon, Chilion. We have their ancestry. We have their hometown. These are obscure people in one sense, yet God is taking us right down inside a normal Jewish family. In other words, coming out of the book of Judges, this little story then shows us a window into how the events of the time of the Judges impacted real families on the ground, so to speak. And there will be many moments in this story that will remind us that they were real people. There will be deep emotions, including paralyzing sorrow and astonished joy. There will be questionable decisions, people changing their mind, struggles for obedience and faith. So it may be a 31 or 200-year-old story, but they will sound a whole lot like us because humans are humans. The same struggles. So number 3, it's a story of a real family. Number 4, it is a story of loss and gain. Loss and gain. It's easy for us to read chapter 1, verse 1, and skim right over the words, there was a famine in the land. Sometimes in California we talk about drought. Is that the same thing? California drought in 2019 and famine in Israel 3,000 years ago? I don't mean to make light of the costliness of drought, especially for certain industries, but for most Californians, drought means you can water your lawn less. That is not what famine meant in ancient Israel. Famine meant, is there any way you're going to have food to survive? Famine was life or death. And so verse 1 continues that Elimelech and his family left, going to sojourn in Moab. It was probably intended to be a temporary move, and we can talk later about whether they should have left or not, but for now, just imagine what it would mean for you to have to move to a foreign country and start over again just to try to stay alive. How much loss would that involve? There's just no way to get the illustration right, but try this, just to try to picture it for a second. Let's say there's an earthquake that hits Southern California of such a devastating level that you have to leave Southern California. There is not provision here. And for whatever reason, the place you have to go is across the border into a town in Mexico, where you have to figure out how to make money and get food and survive. Would that shake your life up a little bit? That's the kind of thing that happened to this family. So verse 1 suggests fear and hunger, heartache and loss. Verse 3, into that scenario, the dad of the family dies. We have to add that. So now Naomi is a fairly young widow. And verse 5, both of the boys died. So what is this? Loss, 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 loss. That's what we have in the first five verses. And in verse 6, when Naomi gets ready to return to the land of Israel, she has gained 2 daughters-in-law who begin to come back with her. Whether she wants them to come back is another question we'll talk about later. And she has heard that Yahweh has visited his people and given them food. So maybe there is some hope that after tragic losses there will be some gain again. Not that Naomi was hopeful. She seems to have had little hope at all other than whatever motivated her to try to come back and find food. But look at chapter 1, verse 21. She comes to Bethlehem and she says, I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Loss, 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 and now I have nothing left. Was God's grace at work even as she trudged back home, feeling like she had lost everything and God had taken it all away? It was, though she couldn't see it. So this is a story of loss, and there will be gain, of tragedy, and in the end there will be provision, of heartache and ultimately blessing, which sounds a lot like real life. And this story will challenge us to consider some pretty hard questions. Did you notice when we read Judges chapter 2, it says, the Lord was angry with them. The Lord was angry with them. You read that in Judges, and then you come to Ruth, and it says, now this happened during the time of the Judges, and you read about loss, 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 loss. Famine, Elimelech, Mahlon, Chilion. You have to ask the question, was that God's anger? Was that God's judgment? It's not a happy question to ask. Were they just tragic circumstances? Or was God's hand of judgment at work? Rather than calling it a story of loss and gain, should we call it a story of judgment and mercy? I'm not trying to answer those questions with certainty, but it's a book that leaves you thinking. Why did Elimelech die? Why did famine come? What's going on here? Number 5, this is an honest story. You can see that from what I've said already, right? But we'll see that the honesty continues throughout this little book. Just like these first 6 verses just have so much bluntness. God's people experience famine, one of the curses he had promised them if they disobeyed. A Jewish man chose to take his family out of the promised land and into a cursed land. Jewish men chose to marry Moabite women who were forbidden. All 3 of those men died. That's a pretty honest first few verses. And that's just the start of it. Naomi's going to say, God lashed out his hand against me. Boaz is going to try to protect Ruth from assault. 2 of the ugliest parts of the Hebrew scriptures are going to be mentioned. The time of the judges, and the story of Tamar. It is a blunt story with some ugly things. It is real life. But it's only when we look honestly at real life that we appreciate the beauty of grace. And remember, this is a story of grace in darkness. So number 5, this is a very honest story. And that's intriguing when this is part of the story of Israel's most famous king. It's an ugly story in some ways. Number 6, this is an international story. So that begins right away when this family goes to sojourn in the country of Moab. So as I mentioned earlier, Moab's just over the river from, like if you can picture where Jerusalem is, if you just head east a little ways, you'll be in Moab. The Jews were the descendants of Abraham, while the Moabites were not. Another ugly little hint in this story. The Moabites were the descendants of Lot's incestuous relationship in his own family. So the story of the Moabites did not begin well. They did, as a people, develop into what the New Bible Dictionary calls a highly organized kingdom with good agricultural pursuits, splendid buildings, distinctive pottery, and strong fortifications through small fortresses strategically placed around her boundaries. Israel was actually, at least at one point, forbidden from attacking the Moabites because of their connection to Abraham through Lot. But centuries before the events of Ruth happened, when the Israelites tried to peacefully pass through the Moabite lands, the Moabites refused. Later, the Moabites tried to seduce Israel. They tried to curse Israel. And during this time, during the time of the judges, they invaded Israel and oppressed them for 18 years. So Ruth is an enemy combatant, to put it kind of simply, from a very hostile people. Later, one of Solomon's downfalls was marrying Moabite women, which the Israelites were forbidden from doing. So when the story of Ruth involves a Jewish family living in Moab, that certainly raises a few questions. And when Jewish men start marrying Moabite women, it really raises some questions. These are enemies. Would God bless his people for leaving and going to Moab? Was God doing something in Moab? Could God's grace shine among the Moabites? And it's not just Ruth's Moabite identity that points us in this international direction. There is also in Ruth 4, verse 12, I pointed out Judah earlier. Ruth 4, verse 12 refers to Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. Now, we can't be 100% certain, but it is very likely that Tamar was a Canaanite. Yet from her came a son who would be part of the royal line of Judah. And also, if you look down at Ruth 4, verse 21, it says that Salmon fathered Boaz. And that's a complicated part of the genealogy, but Matthew 1:5 says that Salmon fathered Boaz by Rahab, the Canaanite woman from Jericho. So in this book, you have Ruth, Tamar, and Rahab, 2 Canaanites and a Moabite, I think. So this story has a remarkably Gentile flair, international flair, and that has deep biblical meaning. That's not just a coincidental thing or a interesting thing. The original promise to Israel's original ancestor Abraham was that all the nations of the earth would be blessed in him. Naomi was understandably focused down on her personal heartaches, but God was at work doing something bigger for the blessing of all the nations in this story. And that leads us right into our next point, number 7. This is a big picture story. In the moment, the characters in this story have a very hard time seeing the big picture. And we can't be too hard on them for that because we do have 3,000 years of perspective that they didn't have, right? So it's not quite fair. Hindsight's 2020. This is a story of God's grace and provision. Yet to the people involved, it often doesn't look that way at the time And here was something that I think is so critical. They often misunderstand who God is because they're only seeing the moment. Naomi was sure that God was against her. And yet when you zoom out, God could hardly have been more for her in the big picture. So in that sense, it is a big picture story. It reminds us how much we need God's word to give us a bigger perspective when we get trapped in the individual moments in our lives. There's another sense in which this is a big picture story, and the book itself makes that obvious. If you look at the end of Ruth 4, where the genealogy forms the conclusion, we see that Boaz fathered Obed, verse 21. Obed fathered Jesse. Jesse fathered David. So what does that tell you about when the book was written, or at least published? It can't have been at the time of Ruth and Boaz, because whoever wrote it and published it knew about their great-grandchildren. So there's obviously a bigger picture that reaches beyond their lives. It connects ahead to David in its writing and publication. And if it connects ahead to David, Matthew 1 tells us it connects ahead to Jesus. And we already saw that it connects all the way back to Abraham. So this again, I'm trying to emphasize that this isn't, I think some people perceive it as kind of like a random little love story somewhere in the Old Testament. It's hardly that. This is a story that connects all the way back, all the way forward. It is a big picture, intentional story from Abraham to Ruth and Boaz to David to Jesus to all the nations to you from the book of Ruth. Number 8, this is a Christ-centered story. This is a Christ-centered story. So there's this connection to David here that we've already been talking about at the end of the book. But if you go back to the beginning, Ruth 1, verse 1, watch for something that makes you think of Jesus. Ruth 1, verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab. Okay, did you see anything that made you think of Jesus? What did you see? Bethlehem and Judah. Wasn't Jesus born in Bethlehem, the city of David? Isn't Jesus the Lion of the tribe of Judah? So the first verse makes you start thinking about Jesus. The last verse points you ahead to Jesus. I mean, you'd almost think that the Christians took the book of Ruth and snuck it in the Bible after Jesus, because they said, this is so cool how this fits. But of course, Ruth had been there all along, long before Jesus, because God was the one who knew how it fit. In between that first verse and the last verses, throughout the rest of the book, there are echoes of Jesus all over the place. Foreshadows, you know what I mean when I use that term? Foreshadows of Jesus. Like if you looked down an alley, and this is a little bit of a negative illustration, but that's not really my point. If you looked down an alley and you were trying to figure out, is it safe to go down this alley? And there was a door open, and you couldn't see who was in that door, but you could see their shadow cast out across the alley. That might change your opinion about whether you wanted to go down that alley or not. You can't see the person, but you can see a shadow that tells you something about that person. The Old Testament, not in that negative sense, but in a positive sense, is full of foreshadows of Jesus. You can't see him yet, but you see shadows that tell you something about who he will be, what he will be like. And this book is full of foreshadows of Jesus. You know, most famously, it's in Ruth's loyal love. It's in Boaz. Many ways he foreshadows Jesus. We'll spend an entire week on those things. So the book points us to Jesus. And do you think that maybe Jesus did a Bible study with his disciples from Ruth after his resurrection? I mean, it says that he showed them the things concerning himself in all the scriptures. And maybe that's how Matthew knew to make the connections he makes in Matthew 1. Because Jesus said, hey, let's go back to that little story of Ruth and let me show you what's really going on. and put the pieces together. This is a Christ-centered story. Number 9, this is a gospel story. Okay, so the story begins with a move to Moab, out of the promised land and into Moab because of famine. Does that sound like something else that happened in Israel's history? Out of the promised land into a foreign land because of famine? What else does that sound like? What other country besides Moab? Egypt, right? So we have famine and departure from the promised land to a foreign land, a hostile land, and then we have the provision of redemption from Egypt and return to the promised land, or in this story, return to the promised land and redemption for Naomi and her family. And so that little parallel is very important because there is no more prominent illustration of salvation in the Old Testament than the Exodus out of Egypt. There are many others, like the sacrifices, and there are gospel illustrations all over the Old Testament. But if you look at the New Testament, the single most dominant illustration of salvation is the redemption out of Egypt. And so here we have what is like a parallel to that in this redemption out of Moab. And then throughout this book, there are just salvation illustrations everywhere we turn. In my just initial study, when I was working through the book, just kind of getting familiar with it, I came up with a list of about 20 gospel illustrations here in the book of Ruth. And again, that doesn't require you to like allegorize it or see some like hidden meaning or something. It's just right there as you read along. So more about that in another week. But this is very much a gospel story. And you see how that connects again to the point I was making just a minute ago. This story was in the Hebrew Scriptures long before Jesus came. And yet Jesus and the gospel are all over this book. And so somebody didn't craft this to just happen to fit with the Jesus story. God did, because he was working in the big picture. Okay, finally for this morning, number 10. This is a confrontational story. This is a confrontational story. The book of Ruth is sometimes portrayed a bit like a chick flick, a girl's story. But I assure you, this is no Hallmark romance. This story is much grittier than that and much more confrontational than that. And more than anything else, this story confronts us about our view of God. This family's story was a roller coaster of heartaches and blessings, the same kind of roller coaster on which we often find ourselves. And just as we see with the characters in this story, our view of God is often determined by where we're at on the roller coaster. And that's really hard to see when it's us. But when we look at somebody else and we kind of get the bigger perspective on their roller coaster, we can see what's coming next like they can't. It's easier for us to see, oh no, don't think about God like that. You're just caught in the moment. But then when we come back to our own lives, it's a lot harder to see, isn't it? So it's a story that it kind of gets in our face and it asks, what's your view of God? And is your view of God coming from your circumstances in the moment? And then as we see the people in this story and as we see the decisions they make, it really confronts us further. It's like, again, I just picture kind of like getting in your face, like, hey, what decisions are you making? How are you handling your fears and uncertainties and the things where it seems like there's no provision and no way out? How are you handling the moments when it would be easy to rationalize sin because things are so hard? Whose wisdom are you following? What kind of decisions are you making? And this is what has surprised me more than anything else in my study of this book so far. It's just how confrontational this story is. And that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. It's just that if you were expecting to read Ruth and go, "Aw, that's so sweet," it's just not going to go that way. It's not that kind of a book. It's a book that confronts if you look at it carefully. So there are 10 introductory points for us, and that's all we're going to try to cover this morning. But with that in mind, let me conclude by transitioning toward Mother's Day next Sunday. I didn't plan to be in the book of Ruth on Mother's Day, but that's what the Lord of the church arranged for us. And you might think that was good news. But I told the other pastors earlier this week, this is shaping up to be one of the riskier Mother's Day sermons I've ever preached. And that's because this story of Ruth has that confrontational edge to it. Someone suggested that I title next week's message, Manipulative Mother-in-Laws. I mentioned earlier that in our English Bibles, Ruth comes right after what book? Judges? But in some Hebrew Bibles, Ruth comes right after Proverbs 31. And there's a key term in the book of Ruth that connects right to a key term in Proverbs 31 and ties the two things together. Now, ladies, don't panic. I understand that for many Christian women, the mention of Proverbs 31 is not a happy thing because it makes you feel like I can't ever live up to Wonder Woman, so please don't preach on that. So I assure you that's not my goal next Sunday, and I'm not preaching on Proverbs 31 next Sunday. That's not my point. But as we look at Naomi and Orpah and Ruth and the women of Bethlehem next Sunday, it will confront us to some degree, as any good sermon would. And the point won't be to make you feel guilty because you aren't Wonder Woman, but the point will be to consider these women and their God and their view of their God and how God was shepherding their hearts. So I hope you'll be here next Sunday and be ready to be challenged by this blunt and beautiful story. It is ultimately a story of God's grace. Coming out of the book of Judges, it shows us the light of God's grace unexpectedly shining in a very dark time. And it's a light that shines all the way to us today. The same God, the same grace that reaches into our darkness too, is right here in this ancient book.